meaning is necessary for you to even perceive the world around you. It's baked into the structure of reality.
Do you believe in God? Many people ask this question expecting a clear yes or no answer. But I've always felt the only appropriate response really is, what do you mean by God? It's not like the answer to this is clear and unambiguous. I mean, it can't be with a concept like God. Do we mean literally a kind of sky tyrant who punishes us with thunderbolts and rewards us when we obey him? Is God just a metaphor for the forces of nature? Or is it a sort of superintelligence that created the universe and is now watching it from a distance, like the deists believed? And what does it mean to believe there's only one God, as opposed to many, like so many pagan faiths did? My guest in this episode of the podcast is religious iconographer and public speaker Jonathan Pageau. He came down to the studio right after his multi-city tour with Jordan Peterson, and we went pretty deep into the rabbit hole in this one, on the idea of God, why the West is going through a kind of meaning crisis at the moment, the transcendent power of art, Walter White's moral dilemmas, and much more. Jonathan's at the forefront of a new kind of conversation about God and divinity, and he pushes back against the simplistic black and white concepts of both religious fundamentalists and new atheists alike. Anyone interested in religion, philosophy, and mythology will want to dive into this one. I hope you enjoy it. This is my conversation with Jonathan Pageau. Jonathan Pageau, thank you so much.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's really cool that we're able to do this in person.
It's nice to also be talking to someone who's close to my house in Montreal. You know, this is great. I have to encourage cultural and discussion and intellectual discussion around here.
Definitely. It was definitely a plus when you actually said, I gave you the option of doing this remote or in person. And you said, well, actually, we're actually not that far from each other. So
right.
Yeah, really cool. Really, really cool. So you just got back from a multi-city tour with Jordan Peterson. I mean, that must have been quite the experience.
It's wild. I mean, it's really amazing. I think the fact of the tour is amazing already, to be going from city to city and to watch, 4,000, sometimes up to 6,000 people in a room, just wanting to come watch a lecture. It seems like, I don't know if that's actually been done before. Maybe Mark Twain or something like that. But it's really astounding to be able to participate in something like that. Yeah.
How do you explain the thirst that's out there? Because growing up, we didn't have anything like this. I remember, I kind of did a little journey in the academic world and kind of seeing what's out there in the entertainment space. And this seems like a very new phenomenon that people are thirsty and hungry for religious ideas, symbolism. I mean, this seems to be a pretty new phenomenon. How do you explain the thirst that's out there?
Well, I think that, we in the last few decades, we had the new atheists became very popular. They are maybe the closest to what's happening with Jordan Peterson. And so Dawkins and Harris and these guys, they sold millions of books. They actually could, for a while, fill up stadiums. And but there was something about new atheism that was extremely superficial, a kind of reductionist materialism that didn't have much depth to it, and also led to forms of nihilism in society. It's not just them, but there was just a general move towards nihilism, and the secularist, let's say, argument had corollaries that the secularists didn't intend, which is exactly this problem, which is that people became comfortable materially, they became smart, everybody has education, but they lost purpose and they lost a sense of their place in the world. And there's also a type of fragmentation as communities broke apart. And I think all of that is in some ways what opened the door for people like Jordan Peterson to be able to speak back into that with ideas about meaning and about purpose. And it's almost impossible to deal with those questions without realizing that they're linked to transcendent good, that they're linked to something which is beyond, which is bringing the world into itself. And I think that's what Jordan is doing. I mean, his tour is called Wrestling with God. And I still wouldn't say Jordan is a Christian. I don't think so. I maybe, it's hard to know. He's really coming close to it, but he's definitely there trying to figure out the connection between these ancient stories, these ancient practices, and our modern state. So.
Interesting. And for people who don't know your background and what you do, I mean, I was looking into it. You're an icon carver and you work with religious ideas.
I mean, it's also a very unusual background. What does an icon carver do? I mean, in the 21st century, can you maybe give us a little bit of color on that?
Yeah. I mean, it's become a little funny to say that I'm an icon carver. I still play along with it. It's funny. We have to understand the fact that I carve icons in a bigger scope that is within a frame of a transformation that I had in my 20s about how the world functions. And very similar to the thing that Jordan talks about, which is that I realized that things had to be connected. They had to be connected down here, and they also had to be connected to higher forms of participation. And so as someone who was interested in art, who had studied art, I was trying to understand how it is that I can apply this vision to the art practice that I have. And that ended up being this notion of carving things for the church. That sounds weird for a secular person to understand that, but the idea is that in the modern world, art is seen as art for art's sake. And therefore, it becomes, it is set adrift to kind of explore all kinds of ideas. But at some point, you realize that there's a kind of idiosyncrasy to it. There's a kind of lack of vision and a lack of anchorage. And so because I wanted to re-anchor things, I thought we need to start with the highest, which is we need to start with a type of art that is both serving the community, because that's what icons do, right? They actually are given to people. They're in churches, they're doing that. But that is also aimed towards the highest thing possible, which is this transcendent good, which is beyond the world. And so trying to kind of get that first vision is also what led me to the other types of things that I do, because now I write fairy tales, I do all kinds, I make t-shirts, I do all kinds of things, but they're anchored in this vision of not just ideas floating up there and then a kind of business or technology floating down here, but a way to connect them together.
And as an artist, I've worked with many artists as a copyright lawyer over the years. And it's very interesting that it's true that art, when you look at art in a Western society today, I mean, some of it is just completely commodified, looked at as a consumer good to, advance your career, make money. But even the sort of non-commercial art, which is viewed as kind of a higher iteration of art, you could almost make the argument that it's been reduced to the field of aesthetics, like making an aesthetic contribution, or sometimes you can go as high as making social commentary. But it's true that the broader, making a broader transcendent point or divine art has been kind of shunned. It's not something that we see very much in Western society. Do you think that's true?
No, I think that's true. I think that there's a whole trajectory of Western art which leads to the commodification of it. The first thing to see is how art at the outset becomes simply a relationship between a performer and a public, whether it's painting that you make to be looked at, whether it's music that you make to be listened to. We have to realize that in most traditional societies, art is participative. And so there's a reason why there's a connection between music and dance, or music and liturgy, or music and panegyric, because the music used to be written for reasons. And so you write a dance and then people dance it. You write a song in church and then people sing it. And this is a way in which art is integrated into the social fabric. Whereas around the 16th century and moving forward, we start to create this idea that culture is in some ways people who produce culture and people who consume culture. And then you end up, downstream from that, what you basically end up with is something like Netflix, where you just sit on your couch and you eat something, you eat popcorn, and you just decide what it is that is going to entertain you today. But there's a form of alienation in that type of art. And that is true at the highest level of art as well. Let's say visual art now is, you have museums that, what exactly is a museum? You as a museum is a place where you put paintings so people can go and look at it. But this is the very alienated gesture. This is not a natural thing that people do in life. Usually a painting will be something to celebrate a moment, let's say to celebrate your marriage. You have a portrait done to celebrate something, or celebrate the king, or to make you participate in a religious story or a folk story, or all these things. That's what traditional art is. And that's what going into icon carving for me was a way to reconnect with that ancient vision of art.
It's interesting where you go with that, where when I refer to transcendence or to divinity, you kind of say, yeah, but it's also embodied in social practices, in actual society, and in the different rituals that a community will have, as opposed to art today. And perhaps that's why when you see certain, like the Taylor Swift phenomenon, Or, I just went to a Snoop Dogg concert. You go there and you see 20,000 people together. It almost prefigures a kind of communal experience that we've lost, and that's maybe why people feel so intensely about it.
There's definitely a desire to participate, and you can see that, like you said, both in the idea of a fan base for an artist. You can also see it in, in people who dress up as Star Wars characters, go to Comic-Con and cosplay, all that type of stuff. It really is a desire to participate in a story, participate in an art in a manner, because in some ways that's the right intuition, because that is how ancient art used to be in the first place. There's something artificial, of course, about a fan base, because this sounds weird for people, but, let's say you have a folk dance in a community. So you'll have something in common, which is the dance. But that dance will be a corollary to other things you have in common, which is that we all live together. Maybe we're infighting in the community, but now for the dance, we actually have to exemplify a form of harmony that will train us to, embody that harmony, hopefully, in other aspects of our life. But if you go to a Taylor Swift concert, all you have in common with these people is that you like Taylor Swift, and then everybody goes back home and then watches Netflix. And so there's something real about it. I don't want to deny it. I love going to concerts as well. But we have to see how it's not enough, I think, it's not the best vision of what art can be. Let's just say it that way.
Yeah, so it's not as embodied in community values and community rituals and bringing together a community than it used to be.
And the closest thing to that, and you're right, you mentioned it earlier, the closest thing to that, and that's what artists want to do because they feel that pull in them, understandably, is to make their art, or at least connect their art to a form of social activism. And because social activism is a way that people feel connected towards something. Because, okay, so I like Taylor Swift, but I also agree with her political causes. And so now I look at the people around me and I'm like, oh, now we're together in this political movement. And it can give people a kind of illusion of community.
Yeah.
But community is grittier and far more organic than that. It has to do with personal relationships, with seeing like in a family where you have to deal with all the faults and all the problems with everybody. And there's a kind of desire to live harmony despite our differences. It's different than, it's not, political activism is something, but it's not enough to really hold the world together.
I like the word gritty because anytime we get a sense of community or a sense of purpose, but there's no obligations or there's no sacrifice, right, to your self-interest, when it's just, hey, let's feel virtuous and consume.
Yeah. And
now it's a sense of purpose, a sense of community. I was a little bit skeptical of that. It's like, there's things that are missing. No. And in a real community, people pay a short-term price for a long-term gain. People will sacrifice for one another. People have a sense of obligation. People have a sense of duty. And when I see that missing from a community, it's a simile of a community. It's not a full community.
Yeah, and community is annoying, to be honest. I mean, sometimes it's difficult because then you have the person who's speaking behind your back, or you have the people that are judging you. Like, these are real problems that exist in a community. And so it's understandable why some people are afraid of it, but it is the only way to anchor meaning in your life, is to be connected to people. Family is the easiest way to do it because it's still very available to us today, but there are still other ways of doing it. Clubs, churches, synagogues, or groups that come together in a way that isn't just either entertainment or activism there's still ways to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we delve deeper into the symbolic world and this whole terrain of symbolism and myth and stories, I want to just check in with you again on the opposite conception that you've already mentioned about the new atheists. So the materialist view of the universe, of the cosmos. Basically, only the things that you can touch, feel, measure are real. All this other stuff, it's nice little stories, it's fairy tales in the demeaning sense, where there's a deeper, right? It's perhaps an elaborate illusion. Perhaps it's a little bit, I had a conversation with a neuroscientist, Daniel Levitin, who studies music. And he said he had a long-standing argument with Steven Pinker because Steven Pinker refers to music as auditory cheesecake. Okay, just something that is pleasant but has no evolutionary. I can tell that sets you off.
Insane.
But I may have a quote that's going to set you off even more, and I wanted to give that because it kind of encapsulates it sounds rational and objective and neutral when you describe the universe in a material sense, but it is connected to also a nihilistic view, a cynical view of the universe. And so I took a quote from Richard Dawkins, I believe, that brings those two things together very nicely in River Out of Eden. And there's a little bit of poetry here, but the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. So that is the core characteristic of the universe that we live in, according to the materialist argument. If we take, and there's of course different variants of this argument, if we take, let's call it a standard definition of materialism when it comes to the question of God, we can't prove that God exists. All we can prove are these material things. Now, there's a lot of places we can go from there. but there's another notion that I want you to consider as you tell me what you think about that, is that the materialistic view in the West is also associated to the notion of scientific progress or technological progress, everything we have in the medical space, everything we have in telecommunications. I mean, all of that is also seen as an offshoot. So when people think materialist worldview, they also think progress. So if we could just take it really from the top, from the perspective of your perspective, what is it that we also lose when we lose the old, some say archaic view of a meaningful or divine universe?
What do we lose? The first thing that we lose is we lose Richard Dawkins writing his book. Because why the hell is he writing that book if he doesn't care? If the world doesn't have care, if the world doesn't exist in a hierarchy of values and a hierarchy of virtues, why is Richard Dawkins trying to convince me of anything? This is the problem with a lot of the new atheists, is that they ignore themselves. They're like ignorant of their own place in the system. They're ignorant of their own perception. And so he says the world is pitiless and without care, but that's not true, because Dawkins cares and Dawkins has compassion and he's part of the universe. So the notion that the universe doesn't have this, while ignoring your own hierarchy of values in that universe, is a kind of alienation that it's difficult. It's so alienated that it's almost difficult to pierce it. You're faced with someone who is so alienated. They have no sense of themselves and no sense of their place in the universe. They somehow, without even realizing it, think of themselves as this weird thing that's floating above the universe, this like universal observer that's floating above the universe and can look at it without participating in it. It's absolutely ridiculous. And so, and it's difficult because, I mean, I've talked to some of these types many times and some of the new atheists, and they just look at you with a blank stare. They don't even understand the argument. They don't know what you're talking about when you say, what about you? If you include the measurer in the system, because you're the measurer, then all of your arguments fall apart. And so this is the truth about it, is that actually the world that you live in cannot exist without care, because care is you need care even for identities to exist in the human world. Because the reason why we have identities, the reason why we see unity and multiplicity, is because it has a purpose for us. And that there's no way to view the world outside of that, right? And so, because this is the problem, like we take for granted unities, but all things that are one are made of many objects. But nonetheless, we're able to see that they're one. But that unity is related to the purpose for why we see it as one. So we have categories, for example, like grass. Do you think that's a biological category? That's not a biological category.
It's conceptual, yeah.
It is a functional category. And it's the same actually for all categories. Ultimately, they are at the first level functional. And then at the second level, you could say they're analytic, and they describe, quantities, and they measure quantities, and they can predict quantities. But at the outset, they are purposeful. And we know that because it is actually impossible to distinguish science from technology. We try to, but you actually can't, because even in the metasphere, so think about science, right? So you study a bunch of things. Care bounds science just by funding. It's like, what do we put our attention to? Like, what do we actually decide to study at at a higher level, it's because we think that it's useful for humans or for whatever reason to study it. And therefore, even science itself is always bound in care. And technology is not, technology is it is the ultimate version of that, which is that we're taking scientific theories about the world and we're applying them to things that are important to us. And therefore, you're already in a religious hierarchy there. You might get it wrong. You might aim off.
You have a subjective system of values.
Well, what do you mean by subjective?
In a sense that you are making a choice as to something that you ascribe the good to, right? Even if it's reducing suffering, physical suffering, or increasing pleasure. Even the hedonist cares in a sense, because why should more pleasure even be good, right?
So, but let's follow the reductionist all the way. What is this subjective? There's no subjective. Humans have hierarchies of care, and those hierarchies of care can manifest themselves in a variety of ways, and those variety of ways have a variety of results. And we can look at, if you care about certain things, then this is the result that will come from it. And the range of care that humans have is actually objective. You can describe it. You can actually predict, relatively well what happens if, let's say, a community begins to care about certain weird things too much. You can track it. You can say, I could have predicted, in the 1950s that if we over obsess with sex, we're going to reduce the population. And that's a thing you can show. You can say, if you care for one thing too much, then downstream from that, you will have certain results. And that's actually, so much of religious hierarchy is based on that, is saying, if you care about money too much, here's what's going to happen in the result. If you care about this too much, if you care about yourself too much, this is what's going to happen in the result. And most of morality is actually anchored in objective care, and the idea that human beings have hierarchies of goods that are related to their existence in the world, their existence together, and those can be described and you can predict the outcome. Now, I will have to admit, it's not as simple as, biology or, predicting the arc of let's say the direction of a projectile, because we're involved in it. And so there is a kind of self-referential problem with all forms of human sciences that we have to take into account. We can't completely get away from it. For the same reason that I'm criticizing Dawkins, is to say that when I'm trying to apply the moral hierarchy of goods, I'm one of those people participating in it, and I'm one of the people that is in danger of, let's say, over-obsessing with the good, and so I can't completely get out of that problem. Now, the fact that it has that slipperiness to it doesn't mean that it then is arbitrary and subjective in the way that people talk about it.
No, that's right. So there's a difference between subjectivity and complete unmoored subjectivity. And so, but you don't exclude yourself from the problem. You view yourself as included in that process. Whereas a lot of times when you see these descriptions of the universe, that these people, like you say, one of the issues is that they exclude themselves from the universe. Like, no, I have cares in my life and so forth, but the universe doesn't care. I was having a little discussion with...
Because you're not part of the universe.
But you're not part of the universe. So what are you then if you're not part of the universe?
So if you care, the universe cares, because I don't know which aspect of the universe do you expect to care?
Exactly.
It's like, you could say the same about you. It's like, your fingernail doesn't care, so you mustn't care because your fingernail doesn't care.
Yeah.
Well, a part of something and the thing itself is not the same. So you have an aspect of you that cares, and that aspect of you makes you care. It's the same with the universe. The universe cares because we care.
Yeah. So to take philosophical terms, that's why I always think it's a truncated ontology. It presents itself as an all-encompassing ontology, but it is not, because very clearly it excludes things. So I was having this discussion with psychologist Scott Barry Kaufman, and he had a podcast episode with a guest who said something the same, like, his big moral argument was, the universe doesn't give a fuck about you. That was like the big wow. And by the way, there are some, I think, advanced ideas and notions within that. It's like, don't make everything about yourself. There's the laws of entropy. We are all going to go towards our inevitable death. Let's be a little bit humble. There are these moral ideas inside of it. But at the same time, and my argument was this, and Scott really liked that, it was like, every single human life comes to be as an expression of some form of love or at the very least lust, but there was a union of two human beings. Then, as a child, as a baby, you only survived because somebody cared. Not true, my parent. Okay, but the nurse, like somebody took care of you. Okay.
Well, even if it's care in the basest sense, like, I mean, it's care that makes you do horrible things too, right? But it is still care, right? The reason why I would kill someone is because I have a thrust, I have a movement towards a good, even if I misrepresent it. And, all human action is anchored in care. Anything you do, whether it's drinking water, or shaving or whatever. And so, of course you could say that there is a hierarchy of care, but like you said, all life is based on care. And that is what life is. Life is the difference between inert matter and life is the fact that life is autopoietic, that it wants to preserve itself, and therefore that desire to preserve itself is care.
And then when you even look at it a bit broader and you look at all the people that made all kinds of little contributions along the way, even as small as technical contributions, or when you were a baby, you had that little condition. So somebody wanted to relieve that condition. So they developed this medicine. And you look at the web of care that all of us are, we could very easily make the argument, the only reason you are here today is because the universe loves you.
Yeah.
No, can we not? Or all of this stuff is not the universe.
I definitely like the idea God loves you. I like that better. I think it's a better expression because, of course, the problem with saying the universe, this is the problem, right? The problem with saying the universe is because it is a reductionist argument. And so you get trapped in the problem, right? Because I could say, when you reduce something to its parts, by the way, if you want to know, that is the one trick. The one reductionist trick is always to reduce something to its parts and then to, let's say, embrace the nihilism that comes from reducing something to its parts. It's a trick. You can do it with anything, right? You could say, you could say, why are we shaking hands? Like, when you're just touching hands? Is that what we're doing? So now we touch hands and now we're friends because we touch hands? Well, this is ridiculous. But, you can do it with anything and reduce it. So the problem with when we say the universe, it's a desire to reduce the universe to its constituents. And that's why you can say the universe doesn't care. But if you would, like a person, if you would formulate the universe as a hierarchy, right? So you, like I said, your fingernail doesn't care. Your fingernail is part of you, but your fingernail doesn't care. The aspects of you, it's a differentiated,
parts
don't care. They only care when they're brought together into a single being that is autopoietic. And so that's why it's better to say God loves you than to say the universe God loves you, because it's only the manner in which the universe comes together into one head, you could call it, into one purpose, into something which is beyond its parts, like you are beyond your parts. That is the only way to understand that there's care. And so you see it, like people get it's so interesting. You've probably noticed the fashion people have now to say like I send it out into the universe. I ask the universe, like, why are you asking the universe? It's like if I'm standing in front of someone and I would say, I ask your body. It's like, no, you don't ask, you ask a person. Like you don't speak to parts. We don't speak to multiplicity. We speak to unity. That's the only way you can speak to.
Even the universe is the beginning of a reductive view of, let's call it, existence, because it's kind of like this material plane. So we're assuming that it's a strictly material plane. It reminds me of a quote from, I don't know if you know the Rupert Sheldrake. So Rupert has when he talks about the origins of the cosmos and the universe, he says, the materialists say, spot me one miracle and I'll explain everything else. And the miracle is the sudden and unexplained apparition of all the matter, all the energy, and all the laws of the cosmos at one place, at one time, for absolutely no reason whatsoever. Spot me that, and I'll explain everything else. And it's like, well, that's kind of, you're asking me to spot you a lot there.
Well, that's exactly right. The illusion that because people have come up with a theory about the Big Bang, that it somehow explains away things. It just doesn't, because the problem is still there. The problem and it really is in some ways it's a technical problem, right? Which is that the set of things that compose a being are not sufficient to explain its being. You need a hierarchy of beings in order to understand the set of beings. Like if you analyze all the parts of a car, you could not get to the reason for the car, right? The reason for the car is above the car. Ontologically, it's beyond it. It's in another level of care. And so it's just a technical description. So it's the same problem with all of the world. All of the world cannot account for its origin within the system. The origin of any system and the reason for a system cannot be held within the system. So it's a very simple thing, and
It's embedded in a broader something
it
else.
has to be embedded in a higher form, right? That's just how the world works, and it works at every level of reality, and then it works at the highest level as well. And that's why we say that there is a transcendent infinite. Like, you can use the different types of words that people use to say that the infinite is beyond is the cause of the finite, that there is, being itself, and of course in the Christian tradition, in the Jewish tradition, the Muslim tradition, we say there's a transcendent God that is beyond all things. And the way that we characterize God, because God is the source of the care and the reality of the world, it's normal that we'll characterize God with all the good aspects of what we see in the world today. All the reasons why we would care about things get brought into this image that we have of the source of all things.
And it reminds me of something that I read in a Kabbalistic text that says that, and it's just a poetic kind of statement, it's not, but it says that God created the universe with care, with the notion that's called chesed, which is compassion, empathy. That's the emotion, if you want, that God created the universe with. Because at the base of it, there is an act of this and not that. There's an act of we can call it, like all kinds of anthropomorphic concepts like intention or desire or lust or whatever you want. But it's not necessarily an objective reason. Just because you've decided to elevate objective reason above all other values, that's not necessarily what's at the bottom of existence. And what you say, it's like this care, like this and not that. Like that is like a gesture almost.
And you can, it's an analogy based on the realization that is how we act. Like, we act in care. Everything we do is based on care and on desire and on the a thrust towards a particular, and that's what we do when we make things, and so all of this, there's a reason why we make this, there's a reason why we have children, there's all these reasons, and those were analogically brought into the source of being itself.
And I think that's what Richard Dawkins does as well in his own metaphysics, because describing the universe as pitiless indifference, I believe in his moral universe, means I'm going to dispel illusions, because I'm going to describe things how they really are so that we can be more accurate and more truthful. I believe he is going for his highest good is probably something like, let's call it objective truth. And that's what he's attempting to do when he's doing that. But even that is an expression of care.
Yeah.
Because why objective good? Why objective truth if that's not a good thing?
And the problem, again, this is the problem of objective truth, is that I'm not saying objective truth doesn't exist. Of course it exists. Objective things exist, but they always exist. We only describe them towards purpose, right? Because when you say objective truth, at what level are you talking about? Are you talking about a quantum field of possibility? Is that the objective truth you're really, or are you talking about the atomic level? Which level are you talking about? And how high can you go? Because the complexity at the lowest level that comes into unity, and that complexity moving into unity, you can keep going. Actually, from the human, we have cities, we have forms of being that bring us together, right, at higher levels than the individual. But then Dawkins will say something like, well, those are illusions, like those are just projections and all these things. But why? Why are they more projections? Because we are the body for it than our bodies, right? It's like, or the bodies that make our bodies. Like, my body is made of stuff, and that stuff is made of other stuff, and you just keep going all the way down.
So let me
bring I can be the stuff for a higher body.
Yeah, I follow the line of thinking, and I do really follow it personally. I think along the same lines, but I'm going to put you something that, let's say, would come from a new atheist, that is something that people who want to experience the world as meaningful or as purposeful have to contend with at some point. And it's the question of miracles. So we have this whole way of looking at religion as either literally true or symbolically true, right? We have this categorization, right?
Yeah.
when there is a description of a miracle, is the intention of the text to say that that actually happened factually, or is it symbolic of some kind of a moral lesson or something that we can really understand? And miracles are ontologically, so in terms of like a nature of reality, they are the phenomenon that we have to confront this question of literal or metaphorical, because do we believe that these things actually happened or not necessarily? Scientists would say, well, this is not how the world works. This is not how we observe the laws of nature and everything that we've seen in recorded history since, let's call it, the last few hundred years. There's no such thing as a splitting of the sea, or there's no such thing as coming back from the dead, or there's no such thing as a human being walking on water. These can be dispelled. And so some people try to recover the religious text by saying, okay, but there's a lesson there, and maybe this is how people described it. And I know Maimonides in his book, The Guide of the Perplexed, was very keen on using this idea of linguistic symbolism as this is what usually when the text refers to miracles, sometimes it's just a figure of speech, or sometimes it's just an allegory, and there's a lesson behind it. It doesn't necessarily, and that he saw that as one of the keys to reconciling science and religion, is making use of it. I have heard you say, yes, but that is also a cop-out, because if there is an underlying pattern that describes reality, then it has to be true at both levels. So I like that. I like the courage of saying, well, if I am noticing a pattern of reality, then it must be true at both levels. And then some people will reply by saying, well, okay, then I guess I can't engage in religious thinking because that's not how I see the world working. And so personally, I'm very attracted to the symbolic, allegorical, because I believe the power of the stories and the lessons are so monumental that I almost don't need the miracles to be true in order to recover value from the text. But I wonder how you see it.
So the question is, why do you recognize the story of the miracle as having value? What's that, right? And so if miracles don't happen, or if we don't have a scope in our existence for what we call miracles, why do we have them? Like, why do we care about them? And why would someone like Maimonides or the church fathers, for all that, because the church fathers do exactly the same. They'll say the miracles are pregnant with meaning, right? They manifest meaning at a very high level, and they're in some ways cosmic, because what they're doing is showing you the structure of reality in a way that is more than everyday life, okay? And so it's important to understand that, like miracles, even the miracles described in the Bible or described in tradition, they're never just freak things that happen.
No, they're connected to a story.
They have to be connected to meaning, to a story, and they have to have certain form, right? And so the first thing you have to ask yourself is, what is it metaphorical to? So if a miracle is metaphorical,
the incommensurate and incomprehensible. So I experienced, or a group experienced something that was incommensurate and incomprehensible to it. It could not explain it in the language of the time. It could not explain it in terms of regular reality. Resorted to the language of miracle in order to encapsulate it in a story.
Yeah.
That's how I see it.
And so a lot of we'd have to go through different miracles, but like a lot of the miracles, what they are is a conjoining of an event in the world with a reason for the event in a way that is more than ever. So you could say, is it possible for, let's say, waters to be split? Like, that's not absolutely impossible. Like, you could imagine some freak thing that would open up a sea, and I don't know what it is that happened, because the Bible doesn't care about describing mechanical causes. It just doesn't try, because that's not the point. And so let me take an example that's closer to us, right? It's, if a rock falls off a cliff, and hits the ground, that's not a miracle. But if I'm being robbed by someone and I pray to God and then the rock falls off the cliff and hits the thief, that's a miracle, because it's the conjoining of an event in the world with a highest form of meaning. And so that is the way to kind of understand it, because the question is does the world first and foremost manifest through meaning? That's the question. I think it necessarily I think a lot of the things that are happening now, a lot of the cog-sci stuff, a lot of this problem of the problems of complexity and of understanding ontological levels of reality and how they come together is showing us that in some ways there's no way around meaning. Like meaning is necessary for you to even perceive the world around you. It's baked into the structure of reality.
So what you said, so let's say in that example of the rock, okay, what makes it into a story, what makes it a miracle is the attribution of divine intent. It's like, I prayed to God and then this happened. And so there is something in the structure of reality that intended for that thing to happen in response to my prayer. So it would still be embedded in a series of explanations by the human agent and a series of assumptions about the cosmos. I believe that the materialist scientist would reply with the language of coincidence, or no, these are just coincidences or meaningless events that happened, and you formed an elaborate explanation around it. But if reality does manifest itself as meaningful, which is a very radical and very...
Well, let's take the materialist to his task and say, okay, but then you also think that everything that's meaningful is a coincidence. So why are you saying that? Why are you saying it's a coincidence? Because you also believe that when I drink milk in the morning, it's a coincidence, right? And so what makes it important for you to say that something that happens at a level of will beyond my own is a coincidence when you think that all levels of meaning are coincidences?
Yeah, and this is where the materialist view has to contend. So it oscillates between the coincidence or the language of luck and the language of pure determinism. So there's the chemical and physical laws and it oscillates, right? And it becomes an explanatory style. It becomes like, okay, actually you have no free will.
Well, what I'm trying to point to is that it's miracles all the way down, folks. Like it's just miracles all the way down. And so the idea that, how can I say this? The idea that you don't notice that every single time that you experience unity and multiplicity, that you experience meaning in a bunch of jumble stuff, that insight, right? When something comes together, right? Everybody's had that experience. Like there's all this multiplicity, there's all this stuff, and then it snaps together into one. And you're like, aha, I get it. That's a miracle, folks. Okay. And the problem with the materialists is that they think that aha, insight, materialist, moment of multiplicity coming into unity stops at the human level. That there is no corollary to that at higher levels of being.
Again, we are not part of the universe.
Yeah,
like, we are this separate thing floating in the air, and we're observing all these things, and we are invested with objective knowledge, but that is not a feature of the universe. This is something I have never understood, that philosophical position, that we are not part of.
Let me give you a little miracle. Magic exists, folks. Like, people, scientists are hilarious. They're like, oh, it's so ridiculous. Action at a distance is so ridiculous, right? How can you have action at a distance? So stupid. It's like, I do it every day. I ask my daughter to bring me a glass of water, and she brings me a glass of water. Please explain the mechanical causes from the bottom up to why she brought me a glass of water. Good luck with that. You're not going to get to it. The reason why she brought me a glass of water is related to meaning. It's related to something which is beyond the material causes. There's no underlying material causes for her to bring me the glass of water. You won't get to it. Impossible. I said, can you please bring me a glass of water? And then she takes the glass of water and she bring it. Magic, folks. Action at a distance.
Can you explain that with physical laws, right?
You can.
And it's strange because a lot of this goes also in the notion of like how much certainty can you assert a certain position with. And I find it problematic to assert a material conception of the universe that's based on just blind operation of physical and chemical laws when you don't have a way of predicting even the simplest actions. There is no model that can accurately predict, right? And so if it's not predictive, and if it becomes an ex post facto explanation, in other words, after it happened, you're like, oh, it happened because of X, Y, and Z. Well, that's a confirmation bias. That's an ex post facto explanation. That is not predictive. So it's not predictive and it's not falsifiable. Those are the two features of a scientific theory. And this is where, like, I believe science can bring you all the way up to agnosticism.
Yeah.
And you could say, okay, I'm just not sure. Yeah. And I'm very comfortable in this position of agnosticism. Now, I believe that you can't live life as an agnostic, really. You have to make judgment calls. You have to make decisions. You have to root your behavior in some pattern or towards some good. And so you're going to have to make a judgment call at some point. You could be an agnostic for a certain period of time, but sooner or later, life is going to call you to task to prioritize what you really believe in or prioritize what you consider to be good. But I feel a lot of what I see in science is a lot of, like material science and the new atheists, is a lot of what I see with fundamentalists in religion. And that is a complete discomfort with uncertainty and a desire to have an explanatory style that pretends to understand everything about the universe. And that to me is inimical. It's absolutely not. The core genius I find in religion is, let's call it the opposite of Nietzsche. Let's call it the invention of God. Let's call it a concept whereby we say, oh, wow, we are actually very limited. Everything we experience, everything we know, there are much higher forms of knowing, much higher forms of caring, much higher forms of order that we can just very imperfectly have a relationship with. And I choose to have a relationship with that as opposed to denying it. It's a sentiment of humility that comes from an encounter with God, not a sentiment of, oh, this is what it is, and boom, 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 boom. And I see that with the new atheists are a form of fundamentalism in that it's...
But they love fundamentalists, by the way.
Yeah, like, that's who they address.
Why they address.
Yeah, they address them. They address each other.
Yeah, because they are really at the same level of thinking. I totally agree. But the fundamentalists, most of the difficulty, especially modern fundamentalists, is that they confuse, again, levels of causality and levels of meaning. Because in many ways, the fundamentalists have been seduced by a kind of scientific reductionism, but then they just slap God on top, right? And so it's like, basically, they want their holy text to be scientific text. They want their traditional description to be scientific descriptions. It's like, it's absolutely ridiculous. And there's nothing more ridiculous than looking at Genesis 1 and thinking that that's a scientific text. God creates grass before he creates the sun. We have a bit of a problem, like in terms of this being some kind of scientific description. And so, but that's the, and then what the fundamentalists will do, will find some crazy thing, like I've heard them, like the young earth creationist types. They'll like find some crazy explanation for why physically, like scientifically, God would have created the earth and grass before he created, the stars, right?
It's like, I don't think you want to go there, man.
Yeah, man, no, seriously, it's dark stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And that's why there's the quote by, I believe, Rick Doblin, who said that mysticism is the antidote to fundamentalism because it's the acceptance of mystery. With fundamentalism, there is no mystery.
Yeah. There's a desire to kind of contain God completely in a box and in a kind of systematic causality. When you look at the revelations of God, at least in the Bible, like at least in our traditions, that there is a sense in which God says, "You cannot see my face," right? Where God, represents himself hidden behind veils and veils, because there is a sense in which you're trying to engage with something which is beyond the level that I have access to. And that is necessarily bound in mystery, right? In the same way, like I said before, that if you try to take just the parts of the car, the reason for the car is a form of mystery to the parts. It joins them together. It brings them together towards purpose, but you don't have access to it in the parts. And that's true it's the same thing. Like, if you just quantify the interactions between your family and you try to find the identity of your family by quantifying the interactions, you're not going to find it, right? It's something pulling you together that's above you. And it necessarily manifests itself as a form of mystery at the level that we are, because it's beyond it, right? And so I think that's important to understand that the idea that God is a mystery, that God is beyond, it's not a superstitious, arbitrary thing. It actually is the way reality functions at every level, and at that and the level that we now encounter this transcendent aspect of the world, then we have the same approach, where it is like, I'm not going to find God is not a phenomena. I can't find him. He's not hiding under a rock. That's not how it is. He's actually that which brings all the phenomena together.
That's not the order of reality that you have to be attuned in on some level to understand the phenomenon of God.
What do you mean? Sorry.
That's not the level of reality.
No, exactly.
Right.
You're not attending to the right level.
Right.
You have to You have to kind of keep, put your head up and get a sense of it's that which brings it together,
And in terms of like, because a lot of these, when we talk about these phenomena, like reducing God to something you can understand or denying it altogether, a lot of these conceptions are also embedded in very human endeavors. Yeah. So they will have career consequences. They will have political consequences. It's entangled with these human. And just before we get onto the political, I want to know what you think about this, is that when I was looking at a lot of this fundamentalist type religious thinking and also like the new atheist type thinking, there's a sense of certainty that I'm just uncomfortable with on a metaphysical level. Mm-hmm. And when I read the stories of the prophets in the Bible, it's interesting to me in our tradition how encounters with God leave a prophet diminished, injured, humbled. They don't leave him powerful, exercising, earthly power over others and getting super necessary. No, there's always a sense of like, oh, wow, I was stupid. Oh my God. It's always the revelation of God is always an expression of the limits and the ignorance of the human. You leave it feeling, your ego feeling diminished, but your spirit, in a sense, having been enriched.
Yeah. No, it's a difficult conundrum, right? Because, and this is really an argument for all kinds of issues, right? And so the way in which we come together in unity is always a mystery. It's not fully accessible, right? But there is also, once that happens, there is a need to preserve that unity, right? If you think about it that way. So it's like, the way in which a nation exists together is kind of mysterious. Like, okay, so we just live on a land and now we're the one thing? Like, why are we one thing? Why is there a border between Canada and the United States? What makes the United States one thing and Canada one thing? It's quite mysterious, right? And you can explain some of the levels, but ultimately there's a type of mystery that holds that together. And so, but once a being exists, there are certain aspects of the being, certain aspects of the phenomena of unity that will need to defend its existence. And that's inevitable, right? So it's like, you have a family, so now you have a door and you lock it because you don't want people that are not part of your family to come in and hurt the people that you care about. And that's an inevitable part. And some of the aspects of fundamentalism, as you call it, are in some ways necessary for the protection of the being. So you have watchdogs that are like, hey, no, hey, did you, it's like mom asking the kids, did you lock the door tonight? Don't come back after 10, right? It's like, because I want...
Did you just call my mom a fundamentalist?
it's like, I want to, I set rules. I tell my kids to come back early.
Like clear black and white rules and protecting,
because I want to protect the unity of the thing I care about. And so the difficulty with that is that can also sometimes go astray or become excessive. And then people start to protect something that they forget what it's for and
what the purpose was.
They forget what the purpose was in the first place, right? And we have that, we experience that in our businesses, in whatever team we have. At some point, we start to be defensive and we want to protect our little team in the company, and we stop to think like, well, actually, okay, so I want to protect my little team here, but what exactly am I serving? What's the purpose? And so I think it's important to understand that. In some ways, there is a way, like there's a certain compassionate approach we can have. As you notice, I don't like fundamentalists very much, but I can have a certain amount of compassion in understanding that the assault of the modern world on the religious sphere has created a bunch of warriors that are trying to protect their body. Right?
And it's interesting that Muslim fundamentalism that people talk about and so forth is an extremely modern phenomenon. Definitely comes after the Industrial Revolution, so it would fit what you're saying as almost a response to the assault of material science on the entire possibility of religion, on the entire possibility of an enchanted divine world.
Yeah, and so we don't want to defend the actions that they pose. That's not the point. But the point is, if you want to mitigate the effects of something, the first thing to do is to understand it. So to understand the fact that in some ways fundamentalism is a side effect of modernism because it is a reaction to the assault of modernity and Enlightenment thinking on religion, then we can say, okay, well, how can we mitigate that and then point these guard dogs, or at least connect them to something that's more transcendent, that's more mystical, that's more mysterious. I don't think it's totally impossible. In some cases, I don't know. Depends which one, though. Yeah.
Depends how far they've gone.
Depends how far they've gone in the kind of...
Exactly. So this intermingling of religion and political factors is something that we see, and something that we see really in all religions and in all traditions. And going back to Alexander the Great, who used to create gods, these syncretic gods that he would create, that they would have a little bit of the Greco-Roman world and a little bit of the Persian world, so that when he conquered a new territory, people would be following something that they kind of recognized, but that also was serving his power. Or, you have that in every single religion, these political influences that will influence even religious doctrine and religious symbology and so forth. And, in Christianity, you have the Council of Nicaea, with the Roman Empire and those kinds of influences. It's really something that we see in because when religion becomes a unifying factor for a political community, it's almost inevitable that you're going to have that intermingling. How do we deal with that? With I'll call it the interference of the political in I don't know what you want to call it, maybe purely religious. Some people will apply the comparative religion approach, like Jung, like Jordan Peterson does that a lot, looking at the commonalities between different religions, and then, maybe then we're getting to an approximation of something that's a little bit more pure and universal. Other people can maybe take one tradition and try to excavate and remove, oh, no, that was political. Oh, that was transcendent. So almost like an excavation kind of enterprise. How do you account for the influence of the political, and how do you deal with it?
Well, so the political is part of the world, right? It is an aspect of reality. In some ways it usually is. Often the political is that aspect of the world that is there to provide material unity and defense against, invasion or attack on that material unity. What I mean by material is, like, let's say physical safety, right? So it's like we have homes, we have families, we live together, and that exists in the political sphere. So you can't get rid of the political sphere. It's impossible. And because in some ways, religion is there to provide that at a higher level, right? So you could say, we are united, one nation. The United States, Eisenhower added this one nation under God thing. It's not a bad idea. It's like, so we're one nation, we're united politically, but we need to declare that unity is serving a higher purpose. And people will say, well, why does the unity have to serve a higher purpose? But you would really hope that the unity of your nation serves a higher purpose, because if it doesn't, then it can devolve into really, really dark things, right? It can devolve into, the Third Reich, which was one nation, folks, like one nation under what? Under Hitler, like under an ideology of nation,
a transcendent idea, like God at least has the potential to fill us with a little bit of humility, as opposed to a human ideology.
That's what you hope.
Yeah.
Right? And so you can't totally avoid that there'll be interpenetration between the two. The best thing you can hope for is that the alignment is right. And so you could say God gives us the higher set values. He gives us a way of being, a way of living, a set of values, a set of morals, all these things, and that those feed into the political sphere. The danger, of course, like you said, is because the political sphere is the place where you have all the weapons
and the money and the influence
money and all that stuff. Then the tendency, the desire for the political sphere is to try to usurp that authority. And it's interesting because in the Bible, you'll find really powerful examples of that, right? The story of King Saul is a good example of that, where King Saul is the king chosen by God, but he's constantly like wanting to be the one to do the sacrifice. He like wants to take over the religious sphere. And when that happens, then that's when all hell breaks loose. It can happen in two ways. In the West, we saw it happen in two ways. One is, on the one hand, the religious authority trying to have temporal power. So you have the Pope who now wants a nation and an army. And like the Pope in the Renaissance had a standing army, which is insane, right? Think about it. He's supposed to be the religious leader, but he's also at the same time a kind of political leader.
Yeah.
And the other problem is when the state or the political power tries to usurp religious power. So that in history, in the Western world, you saw a lot of that, like the kings of France, for example, trying to humiliate the Pope, trying to take over the religious sphere. The best way is to keep them separate and in the right balance.
Is that where you think the underlying reason behind why it's the separation between church and state, let's say, was such a powerful
That's
force?
the best way to do it. The best way to do it is to separate church and state. But we have to be careful that separation isn't like an absolute separation in the sense that we're completely in our different spheres and we don't talk to each other. That's a little ridiculous. It's rather to say that you separate church. You have spiritual authority, which is the highest. It's a beautiful principle, right? So you have spiritual authority, which is moral authority, which is showing us how to live. And then those people, they have no political power. They don't have armies. They don't have a way to enforce their moral position at all, physically. And then you have the political power that receives its way of being from the spiritual
They're directed
authority.
by the more,
And then they have a way to, so you want to keep that balance. It's very difficult. I mean, obviously you could say the entirety of Western history, from the fall of Rome all the way to like World War I is a problem of negotiating between spiritual authority and temporal power. It's a nearly impossible thing to do, but in some ways it is the only way for it to function.
I've always found it interesting, Jonathan. I wonder what you think of that in our tradition. So when I say our tradition, I mean, people say Judeo-Christian, but it's really Judeo-Christian Muslim because I call it Abrahamic, let's say, okay? The Abrahamic tradition, because there's a commonality of history and, in the figure of Abraham, let's say, as the starting point for something different. The story of Abraham reveals itself as a rejection of the man-god of the agricultural societies. So before Abraham, there was a complete union of the two. The human being that was at the top of the pyramid was viewed as God on earth, God's representative on earth. People believed that the Pharaoh was immortal. People believed that they had supernatural powers and so forth. Abraham comes along and says, wait a minute, this is just a human being. There is a higher order here. I need to leave. And even if that means a life of, and establish a new land, and establish a new order in the promised land in the future. Okay, so God is revealing itself to me as the authority that is higher than the man god of the agricultural society. In a sense, that's when we start, right, kind of separating the realms of the political and the, let's call it the divine or the religious.
Yeah, well, you see, I mean, in the Bible, it's tricky. It's interesting because in some ways you kind of see that separation at some point happen, right? So when Abraham receives the blessing from Melchizedek, Melchizedek is a priest king, right? So he's both at the same time. And so there's this idea that there is a way, but there is a notion that there can be something that unites the political and the spiritual together, right? But what happens in Abraham is that the whole book of Judges shows you how dangerous that is, man. It's like the book of Judges is just about these spiritual figures that come up and then are also like political figures, and they start to fight, and it's like constant chaos, right? And it says in the book of Judges, like, there was not yet a king in Israel. There was not yet a king in Israel. And so when they finally establish kingship in Israel, then you have that separation where you have the prophet Nathan. Let's say a good example is the King David, right? The prophet Nathan comes to King David. Prophet Nathan has no army. Prophet Nathan has no weapons. He comes to King David and he says, David, you took that man's wife, didn't you? Right? And then David receives that as spiritual authority and changes his ways, because he could have killed Nathan. What is Nathan going to do? He's a barefoot guy walking into his palace, right? He could have just killed him. But instead, he receives that spiritual authority from Nathan and changes his ways in the physical realm in order to align himself with that. Now, that's a beautiful vision of how those two things function, where you have a holy person that, is recognized as being connected to God, but has no political power, no financial power, and then, let's say, gives advice to the king, and now the king listens. That's very difficult to maintain. It's almost impossible.
So, wow. Where does that leave us in terms of our, right? Like when let's say average human being wants to start looking at these texts, wants to start looking at these different traditions, they don't know. Everything seems entangled today. Is this person just trying to be an influencer? Is this person just trying to go for political office? Now they manifest themselves as the savior of the community and God's chosen. does this religious person, it all seems so entangled in today's world, maybe as a function of a loss of order. As we've gotten more sophisticated and advanced technologically, we've also lost the underlying spiritual order, and that those clear separations are no longer there. This idea of a separation is also something that's very connected to the concept of holiness, is that keeping
it separate.
Keeping it separate. We seem to have lost that, and that maybe
there's still residues that can be resurrected, I think. Like, for example, I can only speak for my own tradition. In the Orthodox Church, we have monks, and those, a monk is someone who sacrificed everything, who like goes and lives in a monastery, he fasts, he prays for nonstop, and his whole life is a living sacrifice. And so that monk, in some ways, and the monks are not allowed to have public office. This is true in theory still in the Catholic Church. Also, like a priest, a bishop is not allowed to have a political office. It's not always been the case, but
rabbis are allowed to be entrepreneurs. They're allowed to have their little version of a community, right? And then have it also be a livelihood.
Is there a separation like that in Judaism where, for example, someone recognized as a spiritual authority would not run for office?
We do have that. It would be still somewhat respected, but there are very blurry lines. So there'll be the spiritual leader, but they'll have a very close relationship with the political leader of a political party.
Yeah.
And sometimes those lines get blurry, but there is supposed to be a separation. They're supposed to be focused on not on earthly power.
Yeah. Well, even that small separation, which, like you said, sometimes can become a little tendentious, is already something, and it's already powerful, because in some ways it prevents a complete meltdown. Because the worst thing would be to have, let's say, rabbi president who's like the head of the state of Israel and the army, and is saying, well, hey, I'm speaking for God, folks, so let's do this. That would be the worst thing. And that's why, like, for example, like the in the times when the Pope had a standing army, it was like, that's dark stuff, because he could remove the sacraments from his political enemy and say, there will be no baptisms, no marriages, no funerals until you follow my political desires. And that's when that happens, it's full on corruption.
So the separation of the realms, that is something that is almost like axiomatic. We've got to go back to that as getting kind of signs of, like, are these two things being intermingled, and it's funny because we think of, in the political realm, there's a lot of religious talk as well, right? More and more people are speaking for a higher purpose, a higher truth. And in the absence of organized religion, they can almost claim that ground. It's kind of, you see the expansion of the political.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, especially today, activism is often secretly a form of religious practice. People who get involved in these causes and really, throw themselves and become completely taken up by certain political causes are usually lacking the truly transcendent, and are giving to the political what should be given to God, right? Like Christ
secular
says,
religions.
Yeah. I mean, Christ says, give to God, to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God. The idea that these two, they have to remain separate to some extent, and that one is not the other. That's a danger. And it's also the danger, and I think this is something that a lot of the new atheists are kind of realizing, is that they thought we'd just get rid of God, and then we could all be nice, happy liberals, eating bagels and going to the coffee shop. But it's like, that's not what happens, right? People have a yearning to participate in something higher, and then they end up throwing themselves into these weird kind of activist mindset.
Yeah, and political leaders can capitalize that, and they can hijack that desire for their own purposes. And if you don't have the bulwark of religion, in a sense, then they become absolute. And I think Nietzsche wrote about that, and many people worried about that. When you saw that separation, when science started becoming what science is today, a lot of very prescient thinkers predicted that we might end up in something like this.
Yeah.
Very, very large, like secular religions, the overtaking of what was formerly religious power by the political, and it's something that you definitely described there. I know we're coming up on a little bit of time. I really feel like this is like the kind of like rabbit hole stuff that is also extremely practical and extremely relevant to our reality that we live today. I mean, I could spend hours talking about this stuff. I just love your perspective here on purpose, and on maybe a couple more questions for you. I've been dealing lately with the issue of purpose externalities. Okay, so a purposeful activity can be lived as purposeful by someone, but also impose costs or damage other people. Okay, I mean, I always think, like, for me, like, the Nazis were living a life of purpose. In their moral universe, they are rescuing the Aryan nation. They're willing to die for it. It's a clear purpose. They are sacrificing themselves for the cause. They're living with purpose, but look at all the potential for purpose that they eliminated as a version of that. So that's a version in economics. There's the concept of externalities. When, okay, your company's making $2 billion of profit, but that's only because the state has to clean up its mess and give it a $5 billion. So it's really like a net negative. So there should almost be a principle of, at the very least, in pop culture, another classic example of this is, I don't know if you saw the show Breaking Bad, but with Walter White, right? And that the classic moral dilemma there is that, okay, in order to sort of do what's right for his family, he believes he has this cancer and he's going to die. Well, look at the trail of destruction that he creates around. But it's really to rescue his children that are vulnerable and that have special needs and so forth. But in order to rescue 2 lives, it's high purpose. But look at all the trail of the damage that he got. We would almost need a kind of a principle where when you follow your purpose, you should almost not, at least be like neutral with respect to the rest of humanity. I mean, if you could contribute to the rest of humanity, that's great. But that's very difficult to do. But at the very least, a kind of a silver rule of, like, don't harm others.
Well, it's interesting because Breaking Bad is a great example. I mean, so well written too. It's a great example of an objective hierarchy of goods, which is that, Walter White makes a mistake. Basically, he misunderstands how the universe works, and therefore he misaligns himself. He says, well, I'm willing to do these horrible things in order to save my family. But in the end, he loses it all, right? Because he misunderstands what is the highest good and how the world actually lays itself out. It's actually a really good example of understanding the problem misalignment. And so I think that, how can I say this? It's like when we throw ourselves into certain purposes, those purposes have to be set into higher purposes. Even if you can't explain it, if you can't see it explicitly, you should at least be able to understand it intuitively that, if I have the purpose of making a lot of money, it's like, that is not a sufficient purpose, right? Because I have to live with other people and I can ruin all my relationships by trying to make huge amounts of money, and then I will be miserable. It's an objective thing, right? It's like, my purpose can be like, I want to take as much heroin as possible, and I'll get like huge amounts of satisfaction for a very short time, and then on the longer arc, then it'll swallow me up. And so the virtue hierarchy that we have in the West is an objective one. Like, it's not if you follow this hierarchy, you will have the longest possible sense of satisfaction and a purpose. But if you misalign it, then you will get high levels of purpose, but that will ultimately come to get you. Like a good example, and I hate to
if it's not embedded in a higher purpose.
Exactly. Like a good example that I've seen recently, and I hate to pick on him because he's an amazing guy. Like, I saw an interview with Mike Tyson where Mike Tyson was talking about the fact that he is suffering because all he is a rabid dog out to, like, destroy. Like, that is what he set himself out to do. And now, because his body is failing him, he is hopeless. And it's like, that's something to learn from because he is amazing. I mean, he's an astounding athlete.
You know the story of how what healed him mentally? So his hands were his instrument of mass destruction, right? That he was a boxer. And for a very long time, as a boxer and as that rabid dog expressed to his hands, the hands had all of that destructive energy in them. And he said that when he started healing was right around the time that he started playing with pigeons with his hands.
Right.
And it's almost turning this blunt instrument of destruction into with something very, very delicate, like the pigeons, allowed him to start healing. But I mean, that challenge of like seeing yourself as an identity, as the destructor, that could come back. Even after you've healed yourself, it could come back. But I found it very interesting how turning the instrument of, let's call it of war, into an instrument of peace itself, that is what created a lot of the psychological healing for him.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think that in some ways, like for him, like as a person, that he has to do that. Like he has to be able to insert his identity into a new identity, into a higher identity, or else, he will, for all intents and purposes, find himself in hell, because his own desire, like we talked about this off air a little bit, like, if you want something completely and you throw yourself into it, sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you is that you get it.
The curse is that you get it.
Because once you get it, you realize that it's not enough. And then you can be completely devoured by your own desire, because now you've reached it, and now you still have this emptiness. And so what do? You're tortured by your own desire and your own capacity to attain what you wanted. And so that's why there is this hierarchy of goods, right? It's like you want to be successful in the world, but you want to embed that into something higher, like a family, because you want your success to serve something, an example to your kids, a way to provide for them. But then even that's not enough. Like you keep embedding it into higher goods. Then you want to be, you could see it like a lot of people who become extremely wealthy, and thank God for that. They turn around, they're like, oh, okay, now I want to give. Now I want to help and do these great things. And it's like, that's exactly how it should be, right? And if you don't do that, you can really be in trouble.
I wonder what you think of this idea. I almost feel like purpose is the gift of being able to consciously direct what you contribute, whatever your achievements are, to, because if you don't do that, in the end, what there objectively is your death. And this is what happens at death. What happens at death? Nothing. No, not nothing. I always tell people, do the exercise. What actually happens at death? Let's be objective scientists about this. What actually happens to that? What happens to all your money? Oh, nothing. No, not nothing. What happens? Okay, it gets passed on to other people, right? Somebody's going to take it. No, nobody's going to take it. Okay, the state's going to take it. Somebody's going to take it. Okay, cool. What happens to your physical? Nothing. Nothing happens. No, not nothing. What happens? It's going to go back to the earth. Okay, cool. But, that's not all I am. I'm also stories and ideas. Okay, what's going to happen to your stories and ideas? Nothing. No, not nothing. Where are they going to survive? Oh, in the hearts and minds of the people who know you for a little bit. So in the end, everything is given. Mm-hmm. Yeah, objectively, everything is given. Purpose is the gift of being able to direct what and who you give it to while you're still alive.
Yeah. That's great. That's a great way to think about it.
Yeah. So maybe on that note, man, I have so many more questions for you, Jonathan. Maybe we can do this again since you're so close. I would love to continue the conversation. We haven't even talked about fractal patterns. Oh my God, the rabbit hole that you threw me down when you started talking about fractal patterns in one of your interviews. I'm like, fractal, what is that? It's kind of like a leaf. It's kind of like a... So I found a documentary. I don't know if you've seen this documentary, Fractals, The Hidden Dimensions, where they talked about the work of Mandelbrot.
Yeah.
What a rabbit hole that is. But there is no way that is anything less than 30 minutes.
Oh yeah, that's another conversation.
That's another conversation. The embedded order in nature. That's man, we'll have to do that in part 2. But Jonathan, thank you so much. This was I do these interviews partly selfishly because I do them to learn, really, learn ideas from people that I look up to, people that I believe can teach me something, people whose work has inspired me and helped me. And it's always like asking these little clarifications, along the way. And I really hope that it can help people who are thinking about these issues, thinking about these ideas. And definitely this has been surprising and very, very enlightening in a lot of ways. And I could have predicted that just knowing your work and your depth of thinking. So thank you so much. And thank you for coming in and doing it in person.
Well, thank you. It was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it.
Sounds great. All right. Thanks.